Thank you so much, Seth. And thank you to the organizers of Queer in the Classical, as well as the Classical Studies Reception Network, for being able to bring this wonderful seminar series here today. I must confess, I got very meta very quick once I heard that the theme was before a time when I had form. I was very interested in thinking through what it means to find origins of sexuality or sexual cultures within myth, since so much of myth that I study is really just bound up in different types of sexual practices. And so in putting together this presentation, I also wanted to include different forms in of itself of me giving this information. And so I am going to actually start and end after this introductory preface, this presentation with poetry to help sort of situate a lot of the specific forms of myth. Most of the myth that we look to in antiquity comes in different types of poetic forms. So the first poem that I am going to start off this entire presentation with is a poem from a longer piece called Decomposition of It All, from an edited volume called Coming to Know, edited by Anita Goes and Brooke Holmes. That's all around acoustic archaeology and archaeology of sound. And it's within this piece that I also situate my own theory of mycorrhizal mythophony, which is a theory of sounding hyphae, or thinking through how myths and fungi have very similar practices, especially around aspects of sounding in multiple senses of that word. And so I wanted to start off with that myth, or with that mythic poem that I helped compose, to sort of like help situate my own position on the ecological queer origins of myth that I see. A lot of my work in poetry, is especially in sort of queer ancient poetics, is looking at sort of three different embodied figures that I think challenge a lot of our ideas of like the origins of ancient myth. I look at the moon, the sea, and fungi, because I think they specifically help us rework a lot of our ideas of form, which is a lot of what my piece Decomposition of It All was about. And so from there, I will be sort of actually giving this talk as an overview of a portion of a forthcoming chapter I have coming out in a Routledge volume on classics and decolonial theory, that's being edited by Catherine Blauen and David Akrigg. My chapter is titled White Narcissism, Black Ecology, a Negro Classical Grammar Book. It overviews what I'm arguing are a God and choral complex that are polarized at the heart of racial sexual cultures emerging out of the 18th century, specifically bound up in a lot of anxieties in that century around concepts of breeding that I'm very interested to trace back into antiquity. This complex is often underwritten or subscribed by appealing to different classical mythic figures. And so thus I theorize a complex is at something like a crown, something that is braided or woven across one's head in the sense of ancient vegetal crowns, which would signify different relationships to the gods. And the crowns of victory in religious musical competitions that poets were constantly competing for, and a lot of their product that we have in our ancient myth origins themselves. The religion in all of this, I really can't de-emphasize enough, or I can't, or the religion cannot be de-emphasized enough, as I argue that a lot of our racial sexual cultures, particularly in the contemporary, have become a lot of dominant religious practice that we organize around, specifically legally organize around. But that's the chapter. And so much of the theorizing that I do in it around the God versus choral complex is through taking a multi-sensory approach to understanding the cosmetic or the makeup of these crowns and their relationship to transhistorical breeding anxieties. And so this presentation today, I'm only going to be focusing on one of those senses, the sense of sight, but similar to my interest in sound, sight I am deploying in three separate spellings here: sight in the visual sense, sight in the sense of place, and sight in the sense of reference. And I want to use this lens to view and review a lot of the ancient myth evidence around Greece up through Plato before hopping over to some of the Augustan stuff in Rome and ending with Apuleius. And so this talk is going to cover a lot of myth, a lot of music, a lot of poetry. And really the sort of connecting bit through all of it is going to be hair, as I'm sure you guys will see. And so to end everything, as I said, I will start and end with poetry. I will end on a much longer performance, my own piece of reception as a poet in the field of classics who just wants to study myth, but finds that extremely difficult at only the graduate level here in America. And so I will leave you all with the questions that have been spinning around my head for the past 2 years in the poem Dissertation Track or Diss Track. And so without further ado, let us begin, I say, even though I still have to share the full slide screen. Perfect, there we go. So yes, welcome one and all to my very punnily named A Womb with a Review, the birth of masculine heterosexual diversion and in Greek and Roman myth. So this is from Decomposition of It All. The fungal weaves seek and stitch, the mythical weaves braid and glitch, sparkling varicolored glint and glimmer, glittering, gleaming shades that shimmer through time and space and matter and mulch, with sound and sigh and gasp and gulch. They wander and wonder through waltzes with stars of fiery flowers bleeding out from guitars, braided together in a network of crowns, traded across tongues through kisses and nouns that signify webs of such iridescent seeming, like bioluminescent hieroglyphic hi-fi dreaming up new ways to curl and coil their sonorous hairs together tight, creating queer new lunar tunes within the symphonies of night, whispering strange lessons which were never taught before, like two-strand twists or how the sea ain't got its own back door. And up above the moon had locked onto the swelling sea, turning their back to take the brunt of all celestial debris. They're always changing faces, rather fixated on the tide, till every being on that earth felt liquid rhythm deep inside. They started rolling out of the oceans and lapping up the lands. They started dribbling down the mountains and seeping through the sands. Mycorrhizal knowledge production in its earliest form, till braids, nets, and weaveworks became the planetary norm. Whether in tight harmonies or asymphonic, everything sounds down into the ambisonic. Siren segue, dripping dribble, trinkle trickle through deep depths, expanding choral, ringing, chiming, glistening, glittering, gasping breaths, impact that solid beings could understand beyond their scars. Methods for them to fathom out the makeup of the stars, though not always knowing what one is unearthing, nor endless potential that this might be birthing, from fungal whispers to a post-human shout, picked through some hi-fi and sounded all out. So, to get through things, first, in order to talk about this complex, we gotta do a little queer gloss, a little glossiness, a little get into some of the glossy bits. So two of the big sort of impetuses I had, I would say, in an interesting queer sense of getting into this topic, is one, wordplay. I love it. In ancient wordplay and contemporary wordplay. A lot of the wordplay I do in the contemporary tends to come from Black studies and Black sound studies. But I'm really interested in finding a lot of the ways in which people are trying to think through the sounds of things. And so, even though Plato is someone I don't like a whole lot, I mostly just rely on my Plato friends very intensely to lead me through him. I have always really liked his sort of like endless meditation from his Cratylus on the god Hades and sort of trying to prove that, like, you know, the etymology of his name isn't about him being unseen, this very visual thing, but it's about wisdom. It's about his knowledge in different ways. But I use this quote quite a bit to sort of explain a lot of the interests I have in studying much of the chthonic myth that I do and sort of theorizing around it in a chthonic way, which is what I think of my mycorrhizal mythophony, especially the how much sounding and weaves are constantly being talked about across Chthonic myth. And so Persephone is a figure that I focus on quite a bit. And so you'll see her popping up throughout this entire presentation a lot, because I think she's an interesting point for us to meditate on. Plato says, Phaeropapa, or something of that sort, would therefore be the correct name of the goddess, because she is wise and touches that which is in motion. And this is the reason why Hades, who is wise, consorts with her, because she is wise. But people have altered her name, attaching more importance to euphony than to truth, and they call her Perifata, he says, referring to her Attic name. So I wanted to sort of pause and take this moment to sort of reflect on this one sort of gleaning aspect that I take from Plato. The fact that euphony, as opposed to this idea of truth, is something that comes up again around knowledge production constantly. The way that something sounds, or something sounding good to a person, is often something that can overtake sort of the idea of objectivity in different ways. And so it's a lot of my sort of trying to understand these different sorts of senses and how they interact with each other, and how that helps form our mentality is the reason why Plato is someone that I wanted to talk with about today. But in pairing with Plato, I also wanted to get further into this idea of sight. And it's specifically rooting it in Black queer theory, which is the queer theory on which I was raised. And so I'm going to, the next slide is a very long slide. It's the longest slide I have, but it's a long quote that I really want us to meditate on in thinking through sight, and specifically the sense of citation. Many of us are scholars in different ways. And so in thinking through not only who we are and how it's impacting what we learn and what we're studying and what we take on, especially in mythic senses, I find Amba Jamila Musa's reflections on becoming versus citation to be extremely useful for us. So I'm going to read through this whole quote before I go on. From her sensual excess, she says, though we might understand Harris's, sorry, one moment. Though we might understand, I'm actually going to, my apologies, it's partly cut off on my screen, and so I actually can't read the top sentence. So I'm just going to start at the second sentence with Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari describe as becoming woman. Harris is performing something else. His explicit invocation of Black femininity and its fleshiness challenges the assumed and impossible gendered and race neutrality upon which becoming woman relies, in addition to illustrating the particular affects that cohere around Black femininity. This is why it is important that Harris's transformation exists on the surface, enacted through gloss, makeup, and surgical tape. This is not a performance of becoming. Harris does not become Holiday, he cites her, positioning his body alongside her so that we might read the image to understand their mutual investment in Black femininity. While becoming woman seeks to displace traditional humanism through the disruption of patriarchy and the embrace of the disempowered, it does little to think about the transformations of self that can take place in and through fleshiness. In Harris's explicit manipulation of his body, we see that pleasure and pain emerge from the history of Black female fleshiness. This is summoned by the citation of Holiday, as well as the pleasures, pains, and possibilities that lie within his own body. It is these multiple dimensions of fleshiness that shape the possibility that we can imagine those and those that we cannot. Fleshiness is inseparable from processes of objectification and the production of selfhood. So Musser, in this beautiful quote, was someone that I turned to very heavily in trying to think through a lot of my work with Sadia Hartman in her looking at staging around race, emerging from the 18th century going forward, as well as using the Greek chorus as a queer sort of reference to turn to in looking at Black female fugitivity. But more broadly, I find Musser's idea of citation and really trying to think through citation and how it can impact the flesh and fleshiness as an extremely useful lens to reconsider many of the ancient poets that we have. And in the ways in which they are citing these different gods that they believe in different ways, and are often enacting what they go through, becoming them in different processes that some might argue. But I wonder where citation might be a more useful argument around this, especially in thinking through these sort of complexes that where they seem to be citing gods in different ways. And so it's within the sort of relationship between Deleuze and Guattari's becoming versus Musser's citation that I'm really interested in interrogating a lot of ancient myth. So all that theory out of the way, it's time to start actually getting into antiquity. Oh, wait, go, slide. Sorry. Well, I pressed. Oh, there we go. So this next part I have to sum up, partly because it's from something forthcoming from Oxford University Press. So again, with Plato, why did I use him? Why did I go through him? This is partly from a lot of my work originally on Antigone in undergrad, working under Marcus Fulch, who is pictured here with his wonderful dog, Amelia, who's trying to teach Greek. And so much of Marcus's forthcoming book on ancient imprisonment is looking through the powered and bondage structures and reproducing violence and understanding that in sort of the production of prison ideology, the prison itself, and how it emerges in Greece and Rome. And so a lot of my questions when I was writing my thesis, partly under him, was trying to interrogate sort of this lacuna that we have from antiquity around the fact that we don't have much evidence around women in prison, even though we know a lot of sort of, or we know that they were from anecdotal evidence, but we don't really have an account. And this was something I found so bizarre to try to deal with, because there are so many instances from the archive of women being imprisoned in different ways in myth. It's such a trope. It's so like dominant. And so in talking to Marcus, a lot of my focus was in his second chapter of his book, though he warned me that he's not supposed to sort of release any more of it. So I didn't want to quote it in here because he's apparently been getting in trouble. So to sum up very briefly, we're interested in talking a lot about sort of the aesthetics of bondage that come out of archaic myth. And two of the most interesting examples for me are, on the one hand, in Odyssey 8, as you have a bard singing the tale of the infidelity between Ares and Aphrodite, and Hephaestus creating a bond to catch them. But so much of the focus of that myth then becomes about male gods sort of spectating these two lovers caught up, and Hermes and Apollo wondering if they would actually risk bondage, you know, just to be as close to Aphrodite. She ends up becoming a lusty sort of impetus around the bondage itself, and herself not really being able to be seen as a bound woman. And then the sort of second sort of broader look at the relationship between sexual culture, sexual violence, and bondage that emerged was definitely in Hesiod's Theogony, where we get that fascinating tripart metaphysics of bondage coming around power consolidation from the dominant male gods. First, we have Uranus, who, you know, uses his wife Gaia as a prison, her womb, first and foremost, before he himself loses his own genitals over it. Second, you have Kronos upping the ante by sort of becoming the proto-panopticon and surveying Rhea's womb nonstop and sort of eating his children. And then you have Zeus, sort of the final embodiment of all of this, of realizing maybe perhaps the woman should just be swallowed whole. And so in looking at these fascinating sort of relationships between bondage, power consolidation, and gender that emerged from the ancient archive, this is when I first turned to Musser, whose entire book, Sensual Excess, is trying to understand the ways that structures of domination produce violence. And yet, despite and in spite that, how aesthetic forms around that can often rearrange knowledge in different ways and give us sort of different inroads to approach this. There is a deep sort of radical potential in excess. This is something she really grounds a lot around Black art. She's very insistent. It's not like, oh, it's not that for her, Black artists must, go through all of this horrible things, and suffer in order to produce these things. So that these things are often produced in excess of what's going on. There is just so much extra that is happening. And I think that sort of view on excess is something that I'm so interested in returning to and thinking through the ancient archive. Because as we get into it, you may notice that I realized in trying to sort of write a talk for this entire series that I was like, but wait, I think my thoughts are actually that myth is just inherently something that is quite queer. And in fact, the thing that I find interesting about studying Greek and Roman myth is that to me, that is the birth of like heterosexuality in different ways, or creating different types of heterosexual cultures and practices out of this sort of like vast amalgamous queerness, or at least that's definitely how Ovid describes the world coming into being at the beginning of its metamorphosis. So I wanted to sort of give a talk now talking about masculine heterosexual diversion and thinking through these different types of sight. And I guess this is a broader exploration around the male gaze in different ways and how patriarchy uses it and surveillance to sort of help police us in different ways. The entire world, patriarchy, it's a lot. And so without further ado, let's now get into some of the myths themselves. So Persephone, let's talk with her first. First, we have Persephone and her image, Ninari, crown, and chorus. So one of the first sort of figures that I look at in my chapter on, especially because I'm considering the Narcissus quite a bit across myth, is Persephone, who is one of the most early instances of an intense Narcissus encounter. And so this is my own translation from the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Blossom collaging, roses and crocuses and fine violets in the luscious meadow, and irises and hyacinths and the narcissus, produced to trick out the calyx-looking girl from earth on account of God's wishes and plot for the host all. Mighty fine and twinkling, a revelation for all to behold, of deathless gods above and mortal folks below. From its roots uprushed 100-headed bloom, smelled so sweet that the vast heaven above and entire earth delighted, and the seas frothing salt. The girl marveled and stretched both hands at once around the lovely toy. And so the first sort of interest that I had around sight and interrogation is in interrogating Persephone as this figure who seemed I don't want to say like she seems placed around like compulsively heterosexual, but she has a really intense amounts of belief system sort of building up a lot of her heterosexuality in different ways. And this is always fascinating to me because her original myth in the Homeric hymn, to me at least, seems to signify something much deeper, something much less oriented towards this patriarchal system of marriage. It's Helena Foley's research since the 70s has tirelessly tried to illustrate. And so, but I wanted to sort of reflect on this sort of first instance of all of these visual flowers that are being gathered at this site that happens because it is what Persephone herself later cites in her own witness when she is talking about what has happened to her. But before she echoes actually this exact same line around the different flowers that they collect, roses and crocuses and fine violets, she actually first speaks of a much different type of assembly. We were all playing in the long to after dewy patch. Lycippe, Phino, and Electra, and Ianthe, and Melite, Iake, with Rhodea, with Cariroe, Melobosis, and Tuque, and Calyx-looking Ocuroe, Cruceis, with Yanera, and Acaste, and Admete, and Rhodope, and Pluto, with longing Calypso, and Styx, and Urania, and Desirous, Galaxara, Pallas aroused for clash, and Artemis the surefire. We were all playing and plucking thorny flowers by hand. So we have this very sort of like blossoming assembly of witnesses that Persephone sort of appeals to as she's telling her mother and Hecate about her experience. And so we have these sort of interesting politics of sight, especially around female sight, that helps structure the myth, not only from Hecate and Demeter themselves looking for her, having heard the echo of her scream, but also coming from the fact that so many of these nymphs themselves have names that are very visual, or have to do with their face, or have to do with light in different ways. And they themselves tend to reflect different aspects of Persephone's myth. So going forward, we gotta take a little just brief aside. Let's just talk about Sappho really, really fast. Sapphic psychedelics. Oh, for those who don't know, Sappho spells her name with a psi, not a sigma. So that's why there's a P up there. And I also just like thinking through, it's just such a, I don't know, feels like queer eraser that we don't allow ourselves to lisp Sappho's name like properly. But I wanted to just sort of really quickly touch on Sappho really fast. She's a much bigger part of my chapter, but I didn't have time to get in deep with her here. I wanted to talk about, this is a screenshot from my own piece, Pink Peewits and Dewy Lacunas, what Sappho's critic and Ben Shapiro lack in erotic tempo, which is over on Corona Borealis, to talk about sort of sounds and music and intonations that are associated with Sappho, specifically the Sapphic stanza, which is named after her, even though it's like thought maybe Alcaeus actually invented it instead, but it is something that is intensely associated with her. So I argue in cultural memory, it is something that is often sort of helps, like the Sappho earworm theory that I'm trying to develop. And so I wanted to specifically bring it up because a lot of her sort of ideas around her meters, especially with hendecasyllabic lines, are always around them ending in an Edonian line, or an Edonic, as it's also called. That part is very critical for the next section that I would like to argue. Oh, and brief aside on psychedelics. Psychedelic is just a term that I'm really interested in, like thinking through in its literal ancient etymological sense of just like clear souls. Like, what does this mean? Let's think through Delos. Let's think through Sukes. Let's think through these gods and belief systems. But also, I think that Sappho is just an interesting person to consider around psychedelic in a more etymological sense, because of a lot of the ways in which people talk about her intonation and poetics, and like the sort of clearness or flowingness that they have in different ways. So that's just an aside for why I named that. But getting into her sons, yeah, let's talk about Edonics across the 5th century stage, and especially why something like this meter sort of encourages these really interesting ideas I have around sight and citation. First, let's talk about Antigone. This is one of the biggest sight claims that I've had. I believe Antigone has a dramatic hair change. Mostly because in episode 2, she shows up on stage and there's a lot of ado about her head and how it's sort of looking towards the ground. And so for those who are not familiar with the play, in Antigone, in the prologue, she leaves her house to go bury her brother. And then in the 2nd episode, she is brought back from that task by a guard who caught her in the middle of doing it. And so the guard says, in 398, that labon kaikrine kaxelect, that she was sort of pouring laments and her hair, as is tradition to cut one's hair to sort of offer up for the dead, which is another hook to Persephone, who I'm also now sort of thinking of as the goddess of haircuts in different ways. And then sort of he finishes with this very sort of crowning language of Koaisi trispondoisi ton nukon stefe. She crowns the dead with these thrice poured libations. And then Creon, right before Antigone's first line, he calls to her, Sede, seten nuoisan, es pedon kara, you there with your like head oriented towards the ground, your foot oriented head. And so there's a lot of sort of research talking about this, Antigone's gesture, the fact she's looking down. Is it political? Is it like, her signifying to the gods? Is it all these different things? But I'm just like, but wait, from the Greek text, like this sounds like a very dramatic haircut. I don't know. Perhaps she had a wig change, like within the staging. And so I think that this sort of idea around sort of heads and like feet sort of going back and forth is a really fascinating one for that I've considered a lot around Antigone, considering that it is a play completely around her uncle Creon's wild masculine heterosexual diversions as he tries to sort of order everyone in the play and stage manage. And literally, Tiresias tells him later in the play that like he's turned the world upside down. I think, yeah, kato to ano kato labon. And so there is this sort of like idea of sort of like things being reversed up and down, plus Oedipus, there's always lots of foot puns. But what this also specifically interested me around is that this is one of the only this is the only extant Sophocles play we have where he uses an Adonic at all, and it's within Antigone's broad komos. And it's a komos that to me reads as intentionally signaling towards Sappho in its themes in different ways. The first Adonic that she sings is Pan Acherontos. She's singing about that she has to be a bride towards Acheron in the Strophe Alpha, which is intensely reminiscent of both Sappho 94 and 95 in different ways, I would argue. And then the antistrophe response to it is Hos Phatis Andron, so men say, which she is saying around this idea of Niobe and the fact that she was this sort of stranger from the East who came and sort of like had to go through all this suffering that Antigone herself is sort of putting on. And further on in the song, she also self-identifies as a medic, as someone who is not a citizen, but having to sort of migrate and go elsewhere because of her attention with the dead. And so this entire sort of sphere fascinated me in considering Antigone as a sort of medic, and especially an Eastern one in different ways, mostly considering that 10 years before her play was staged was when Pericles sort of did the citizenship rules around Athenian citizens having to have come from Athenian citizen men and women. And so things like the children of Hetairae were not able to become citizens properly in a different way. And so to me, Antigone sort of signals this much broader exploration around sort of heterosexual masculine diversion of trying to create and stage these different types of reproductions that are also showing up in these musical mythical productions themselves. And so I was interested because in this also because 10 years after the Antigone, we get an Adonic coming out of Euripides' Medea in a very, very fascinating way. The chorus, once they finally learn of Medea's full plan in their third Stasimon, they sing an incredibly sapphic song. Fully recommend the fourth chapter of Anacontes' dissertation on it, explaining more. But they end the song on an Adonic. It's sort of like this final plea. So in the Strophe of Beta, they beg, don't kill your children, whereas in the antistrophe they sort of like come to the understanding that like her heart has hardened to this idea. And I wanted to bring this up with Medea specifically because Medea to me is one of the most fascinating examples of what I would argue is a masculine heterosexual diversion. Medea is someone who is positioned as a Hetairae throughout the text, throughout her play, and yet is someone who is so intensely subscribing to these ideals of Greek heroism, of getting revenge against, you know, the people who are doing you wrong, that she really makes herself into this sort of Hetairae ex machina at the end as she like fully diverts. And it does not help also that in episode 3, so much of the language about her sort of running off to go to Athens and be with Aegeus is very, very sort of coded around these ideas of Athenian citizen women versus like these foreign women to sort of help citizen men have children in different sorts of ways. And so I was interested in sort of both Sophocles and Euripides in different ways, sort of positioning Hetairae and sort of using different aspects, both sonically, but also using visual cues as well to discuss this in certain ways. Oh, also in that third Stasimon from Medea, they really appeal to sort of Aphrodite and Sophia as wisdom, sort of like being there to sort of console Medea. And they speak of Aphrodite sort of like fragrantly braiding her hair with roses, you know, to just sort of like calm her down. But it doesn't work. And so thinking through these ideas of power, reproduction, how to order a society, I did want to end really quick with Plato, that like this is also a lot of what like Plato writes about in his laws in very specific ways, which I would argue is probably his most heterosexual text of all of his like very queer dialogues he tends to have. And actually, I checked in with my buddy, Kieran Montescani, who I quote here last night. I was like, is it his most? Kieran was like, maybe, or arguably passages from the Statesman, but like as a whole, yes. But I loved this quote he then tweeted out later last night of like, what if Xenophon actually wrote the laws in Statesman? And we've all been duped, which I'm like, true, yes, there is a very sort of different sort of energy, especially in how they're exploring sexual cultures, I feel personally. But much of what the law sort of expresses is sort of how to organize society, how to create it. And he uses a very broad music metaphor to explore this. For those who don't know, the word for laws in ancient Greek, nomoi, is also the same word for lyre songs and Kithra songs as well. So there's this like broader sort of pun Plato's using, but he's also really intensely leaning on the heptatonic tuning system of the lyre during the time to sort of argue for a more conservative return to music, because there's just too much new music and all these like different types of musical genres that are popping up at the start of the 4th century, especially following Euripides as one of the huge, like biggest fathers of like trying to push new music forward, especially in a theatrical sense. And so I often call the laws Plato's sort of hetero-gospel of him sort of trying to return to this much more traditional sense. But again, we cannot de-emphasize religion here. This is also because of like, you know, Plato's long-standing interest in Orphism. And a lot of what the figure Orpheus is supposed to be about is his lyre and sort of this embodied idea of the lyre, the 7th string lyre too, specifically during this time period. And so a lot of sort of the gospel that I'm specifically referring to is this much sort of broader interest and investment with Orphism. And Orpheus is a character that I often look at in conjunction with Persephone, because the lyre is something in antiquity that is so associated with sort of happy songs and sort of masculinity and sort of like ordered society. And yet I always have to remind, you know, folks who do music and who like write on that, but like we must remember the most tragic concert we have from all of ancient myth was on the lyre, and it was in the underworld. Like, so it's this very specific type of setting that I think gets referenced quite a bit throughout the archive and in the mythic archive, and sort of help structure myth in different ways. And so that's my very bad segue to Virgil and Orpheus. And so when we get over to Rome, we see this very interesting play throughout their myths and looking through sight and sort of reflecting on these myths in very fascinating ways. So one of my favorites around this is in Virgil's Georgics, when he tells the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is couched in a much broader tale around, well, first apiary management of Aristaeus and his bees, but also in reflecting on this figure and his attempts at sexual violence towards Eurydice, creating this huge tragedy and sort of giant lament that happens. And so, of course, I just wanted to briefly just like read the Orpheus's sort of reflection now. And now, as he refooted his steps, he had all but avoided the rub and regained Eurydice, becoming to the upper world, following behind. For this was the condition Proserpina came. When a sudden mentality seized Orpheus, uncautious of his love, a frenzy ripe for pardon, and oh, did hell know how to pardon. He paused, and on the very verge of light, unmindful, alas, and vanquished in purpose, on Eurydice now restored, he reviewed. So that's my own translation. As you can tell, I definitely played around with words a bit, trying to think through this. But this idea of sort of like looking back and reflection has some very fascinating connotations once we get to Rome, especially how sort of reviewed and over-reviewed myth gets. the best sort of examples that we can see for this, that I think everyone is still to this day trying to contend with this mass amalgamation of myth that was sort of queerly thrown together in some fascinating ways, is definitely Ovid's Metamorphosis, or what I call myth sink for your life. He is constantly trying to sort of realign all of the myths together in these different assemblages, and talking about sexual violence in some of the most shocking and fascinating ways. But first, I wanted to just touch on the myth that had inspired this entire, the myth that inspired this entire chapter that I was originally going on off of, which was the myth of Narcissus and Echo, and trying to think through Narcissus as a figure to consider ideas around complexes of belief systems, how one can create their own sort of self-referential loop of understanding through their own mirrored sort of praxis or experience. And so from Ovid, what he's seen, he's know not, but what he sees, he is inflamed for. And the same error both excites and deceives his eyes. Simp, why waste trying to capture an elusive image? What you seek is nowhere. Turn to out. What you desire is lost. That you perceive is the shade of reflected form. It has nothing of you. It comes with you, lingers with you, and leaves with you, if you are able. And so I was really sort of fascinated by this idea of reflection and sort of like sight, sort of becoming this sort of like intense sight of the self that like one might sort of sight in different ways. And so a lot of these, I started really getting much more preoccupied with how the gaze really does deeply direct how we are moving through myth in different ways, but also how we deal with myth and how we sort of help couch it up with ourselves. And I think that Narcissus is a really interesting point to meditate on for this. But
Vanessa, sorry, we have like 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you.
That's all right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I can finish real quick. And so the final example from Ovid that I just wanted to share really quick was just from the myth of Minerva and Arachne, which was just the final example of an interesting sense of masculine heterosexual diversion that I want to look at specifically in contest, because of the ways in which both Minerva and Arachne approach their weaving competition. Minerva, on the one hand, decides to couch herself up as sort of this girl boss, essentially, who has been able to conquer Neptune, who has gotten the city of Athens on her side, who has basically sort of overcome the patriarchy in this very like acceptable, done it the right way kind of way. Whereas Arachne's response is then sort of trying to deal with the fact that Minerva is entirely seeking the system of validation from a patriarchal god system that is full of and dependent upon sexual violence, and it's sexual violence that Minerva herself will never face, as a goddess promised her virginity by her father, which is something that even Minerva's sisters have not received some of the same consideration from their father, as Arachne does detail Jupiter assaulting Proserpina on the web as well. And so the web's edges with its thin borders is filled with blossoms woven with intertwining ivy. Neither Pallas nor Dame Envy were able to nitpick that masterpiece. The blonde goddess grieved the mortal success and ripped the pics, heavenly crimes of the fabrication. So in interest of time, really quick, I'm just gonna just meditate on Apuleius, who is one of sort of the later sources who starts sort of bringing together hair and thinking through how it can be criminalized in different ways, and using a lot of puns about it, but also sort of hitting the nail on the head of how these sort of the visuals of his hair and how it sort of inspired these different ideas about himself was something he was fighting against in his broader apology as he was being accused. And as someone who's very keenly aware of how recent it was that different cities started saying that discriminating against hair type was something that people should not do, I deeply find myself resonant with Apuleius. And so to conclude, I'm just going to, as fast as I can, because, oh yeah, we really are at time, my bad, going to read through this poem. And I'm going to read through all of it. I think it takes exactly 5 minutes though, so I might be 2 minutes over, my apologies. Because this is sort of what it all comes to for me in trying to grapple with these broader ideas. And all I can, I think, get for feedback from professors are just like, well, why don't you do a PhD? So let's talk about it. My mind's brought to speak on those bodies in new forms, which the gods have wrought through turning novelties into norms, those mythical fabrics that dress up how we believe and sound across our planet in a synesthetic weave, finds that over in America, there is a strange segregation between the ancient and the classical in mythic regulation. When getting folks interested in the classical monoliths, there are few more tempting draws than ancient warfare and myths. The former, unsurprising, America's an empire in conjunction with what the British Empire started in all of its glorious dysfunction. But myth is a more interesting figure. It's traveled far throughout the years, spreading our most obvious desires and deepest latent fears. Attractive to a young country still making up its tales when our ideological records are just a history of our fails. Manifest destiny, doctrine of discovery to subjugate all who were here. Capitalism via the slave trade to loot wealth up through this year. War in Asia this past century helped seal our imperial hold, and yet our primary mythology is unable to keep itself up in the fold. The myth of white supremacies held us bound for half a millennium, and America stroked its ego far more diligently than a perennium. Violence, money, and skin tone is where our beliefs are found from all our tastes, visual aesthetics to the segregation of sound. So imagine finding ancient myth as an inquisitive you, a set of stories and fanciful tales to fabricate a truth. That's Greco-Roman myth in its strange hybrid form as it gets told to us as part of our own Western civilized norms. So you follow the mythic thread. A spider down the spool, Ariadne to Philomela to Penelope in the wool, a tricky arachnid collaging of fabulation so spectacular, realizing the presence of these various myths in your vernacular. Greek and Latin cognates dancing across a mercurial tongue, creating a textured variety as a cereal for the young. Through nature, the hyacinth, crocus, dianthus, and the mint, to the periodic table in its dank Plutonian glint. Volcanoes gushing lava into deep salacious seas, pushing ships of Theseus through inquiring odysseys. Erotic anxieties of cupidinous erection, historically hystericizing venereal infection. Myths give the English language an approving seal. We have a whole medical condition around Achilles' heel. These figures become textiles through the fabrication of hands, as Nike and Hermes, the gods are now brands. Staring at Medusa in the gaze of iniquity, from lessons of narcissism in the mirror of antiquity, teasing through conflations of the Roman and the Greco with bacchanalian panic and a European echo from all these receptions across thousands of years of chthonic, Olympian, and pelagic spheres, ever hungry for more of this classical gleaning. You'd give anything to cross over that threshold of meaning. Till you reach the gates to be let through at last when you first start learning Latin in your local high school class. Dazzling new meanings and word placement elastic as you dance through gerundas and passive periphrastic, learning the tales that the Romans would tell through trivial Curtomen and nerdy JCL, then off to undergrad to learn more in depth about narrative and folklore, mythology, and fairy tales comparative. Myth is the heroic savior of the dying classical field, a subject always drawing in bright minds for scholarly yield, yet crossing the threshold over into the grad, myth was treated like some gauche, embarrassing fad. Too broad, too sprawling across space-time and locus, the professors will always tell you as they nudge you to a focus. You can study myth writers in their individual style, or art history, philosophy, or the archive as a file. Iconography is your best bet, at least then you get to see them as you consider the industrial complex of the modern-day museum. These myths operate as the field's primary honey trap before we get hit with our academy's neoliberal money slap. So if you want to study myth, there's only 4 acknowledged pairs to provide you theory and act as guides through all of these affairs. First, the German forefathers of Müller and Heine, locking comparative mythology into the classical arcana. Then our psychoanalytic daddies of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, reflecting mythological aspects into our subconscious void. But it's poetic romantic archetypes that spark young minds to ramble through the thousand faces, in the words of Fraser and Campbell. But then philology became stigmatized when it met those most nifty structuralists over in France coming out of the 1950s. Myth followed suit at philology's behest, bartering in structuralism's carefully crafted nest. The call may in fact be coming from inside the house, when the last time we updated our theory was Levi-Strauss. There could be inspiration in the cosmogonies of Dweeb, but that book came out last year, far too soon for this field to see. And due to this utter lack of conception, the field has slapped on the band-aid of reception as a way to draw together all the mythic disparate parts, an access point to prove classics ain't snooty about the arts. But the reality of reception begins to look us in the face when we realize how much reception we've been practicing in this place. The philosophy of the DJ, great digging through the past to remix ancient ideas into some new flow that might last, though not always knowing what one is unearthing, nor endless potential that this might be birthing, yet are always mindful of gaps we've misplaced, and genres conflated, whole flows now erased. Thus can't we acknowledge it's a little bit too sick that we barely discuss how much of this myth is music, miss how we encourage interest in our classical axis, but we ridicule its potential because we like theory, not praxis. So instead you major in Plato and his strange mythical assertions. But then guess what they want you to teach once you're past that dissertation? Myth is the easiest ancient class for the administration to sell, because capitalism rules academia in this neoliberal hell. So myth is a subject that's enforced with undergrad, hence the reason it's blown up on the internet as a fad. Digital epistemologies now head this theoretical charge, leading to an ideological break by and large. So when will philology finally come to the conclusion that leaving myth on the ground at the grad level's a delusion? We might also need theorists beyond 8 white men to take another look at these stories again. Myths have a liquid stickiness that braids itself into nets of mycelial whispers around unspoken debts, coloring itself outside the lines of those whitewashing paints from a smooth marble antiquity and neoclassical constraints. Myths present in the dynamics of the field's folly dramatics and persist despite our myths, bursting out through polychromatics. Reception's been the gateway for us to hold the rabble back, yet at the margins of the fields we see myths utilized for attack, like when radical Angela Davis was politically locked away and the American myth-making system came out in full force to play. June Jordan offered empathy from a moonlit Plato's clave, while Toni Morrison smacked a white spectatrix into an early grave by declaring her gaze myopic and ending her quick and fresh, because the other thing about the Cyclops was his taste for human flesh. Or when Alice Walker went to Florida and started lying through her teeth to revivitate Zora's folkways through praxis and belief. Gwendolyn Brooks and Rita Dove fly at the edges of our conception through their poetic interpretations relegated to reception, contestation over meaning in the midst of a heated fray. No wonder we love ancient myth and war within the US of A. And these multiplying pathways myth inevitably takes, I find myself drawn to these community stakes. Black women in particular use it as a defense against racialized mythologies unfolding to condense, yet the field cannot consider these chromatic concoctions since we've cornered ourselves in our theoretical options. But also the issue might come from ourselves, the class of the classics that's kept us on shelves. The worth of that term is one we're unwilling to let go, and what worth means in this time's only going to grow. This grip that it holds on us will only become stronger. Believe me, I know I've been a classical musician far longer. Worth is the impetus on which belief hinges, expressed across America in all manner of tinges. Is that why we give myths such hypocritical grief? Because our work is mostly colored by our classical belief. How much longer can we pimp her out and pretend she doesn't matter? What stories, lies, and myths do we serve up our students on a platter? Do we just prefer to ignore the roots of our issues as they rot? Because precisely how much time do y'all think we've actually got? Why is it so hard for us to look at this ever-present conflation? It's too broad, like our entire purpose isn't centuries of communication. So we clearly have some issues that we need to work through, because I don't care what we should be. What do we want to do? Be defined by necessity in lieu of our desires, just as we're bound by laws to harmony and liars? Abolition's in our roots. Can you dig it? Feel the beats pulsing out from in the void to get us dancing through the streets. So how many more cycles of messy execution before we sync up in symphonic revolution? Thank you.